Splatterhouse was first released as an arcade game back in 1988. Now, I'm pretty sure it was only officially released in Japan. I don't know for sure.
I think it's safe to assume that the game had a limited international release, possibly done due to the game's violence.
But all the manuals and literature I've found have been in Japanese. Now, I'm sure a couple machines popped up in the US, but I still have my doubts. And for those of you saying, well, look at that, that's English, it's typical for a Japanese game to have English text and dialogue.
Well, actually, in the case of this game, the reason it had a name in English was most likely because the game itself is clearly based on American media.
Not counting Virtual Console, I know, shut up. So it's safe to say that most of us first discovered Splatterhouse when it was released on the TurboGrafx-16 in 1990.
Well, that's not true for me. The way I discovered this game was via MAME emulation.
In fact, this was the only version to come out in North America, meaning that the unlockable arcade original in the new Splatterhouse is probably the first official American release. Now, for fun, I thought I'd take you through the two ports to show just how different the arcade original and the TurboGrafx versions are. If you want to hear my thoughts on the other games in this series, go check out my other videos. And on a side note, since my first Splatterhouse video, a number of fine reviews for the Famicom spin-off Wampako Graffiti have popped up, so go ahead and check out one of those. I don't see any point in reviewing it anymore.
I remember he added an annotation in this part that said, "I changed my mind," and the annotation had a link to his review of this Famicom game. I sure miss annotations, by the way.
If you don't want these games spoiled for you, shut the video off now.
I already played these games before, so I don't care either way.
And run to your local store and pick up a copy of the new Splatterhouse.
Maybe I would pick some chick working on that local store instead, lol.
If you can't find a version with a code, don't worry, you unlock them pretty quickly. Without getting into how I feel about the reboot, the original 3 games are definitely worth at least $40. And by the time most of you see this video, Splatterhouse will have dropped in price.
I do think it is worth buying the game, just so you can have the 3 Splatterhouse games legally speaking. I wouldn't recommend playing the sequels on there though, cause the emulation for the Mega Drive/Genesis games is pretty poor sound-wise.
Alright, before we get started proper, I want to clear up something. I mentioned this in my original review, but I maybe wasn't as clear as I could have been. The TurboGrafx port of Splatterhouse was not censored. The Japanese version was not any more gory than the American version. The only differences were the color of the mask, to avoid copyright problems I'm sure, and the 4th level boss, where all the religious imagery was removed. And I guess that counts as censorship fine, but this version is just as bloody and violent as the Japanese version. The reason the TurboGrafx and PC Engine versions were so toned down was because of hardware limitations. Arcade machines were way more powerful than home consoles back then, and 2 8-bit processors couldn't do this game justice. Okay, so first off, Arcade Splatterhouse has much more story. If you let the title screen sit for a bit, we see an intro where Rick and Jennifer enter the mansion. Start the game and you'll see another short movie where the mask floats above Rick's presumably dead body and attaches itself to his face. In the TurboGrafx port, there's only a simple shot of the house. It sets the mood, but never made any sense to me as a kid. Okay, there's a house. That must be the Splatterhouse. It's worth noting the cabin is missing from this shot. Level 1. Right away you can see what I mean when I said arcades were much more powerful back then. In the TurboGrafx port, Level 1 is just a barren, empty cave. In the arcade version, it's the cave happiness and good feelings forgot. It's like night and day. The spikes and bats are still there, so all the main obstacles are left the same. Your first weapon in the arcade is a cleaver, and later a 2x4. In the TurboGrafx port, it only has the 2x4. Probably because they couldn't animate heads being cut off. Again, not really censorship, probably just hardware limitations.
I think it was an oversight, rather than hardware limitations. There is a hack of the game made with the PC Engine version that actually has the cleaver in stage 1, and when you attack the greenish monsters with it, it actually has the animation of decapitating the enemies. It's also worth noting that this hack also makes the monsters have red blood instead of green liquid. You see, Namco actually requested that they didn't want the enemies to bleed blood, so that hack actually has the intended violent animations restored. And yes, this means that even the arcade original was censored. Hell, even those monsters are part of the censorship, since they were supposed to be zombified people, and that is actually more evident when you see the names for these enemies, since they never changed the names when they were toning down the violence. Another piece of evidence about this is how you see dead people as background graphics, but you never fight any of them, not counting the enemies in stage 5 with the Master dead, aka the Necromancer.
The first boss is essentially the same, but is a little harder because there's more places for the Borrowworms to pop out of. You can still pretty much just stand in the corner.
I remember my brother used that cheap tactic when he was playing the game. I wonder who told him about it, cause I doubt he learned it from the internet. I don't use that myself anymore, cause I'm usually good enough at the game to the point where I don't need these tricks. Although I will say that this room with leeches, or body eater, as the game calls these worm enemies, is definitely harder in the arcade game.
Man, isn't it awesome Night of the Creeps finally came out on DVD?
I don't know what that has to do with the game, aside from being a horror movie.
Level 2 was just like the first, significantly more gory. Just look at this shit, God I love this game.
Well, it's nice to know that the game did please fans of violence despite being kinda censored like I already said earlier.
It's also a good time to point out how impressive the soundtrack was for the arcade. So we're listening to the arcade music right now. And this is the TurboGrafx. Arcade.
I can live with either of these chip tunes.
One thing I noticed, the first level ended with a worm bursting out of one of those hanging things.
What kind of a shitty nerd are you? They are called hanging dead. Don't you know how important it is to know these things? Forget knowing about making money. Remembering names of enemies on a video game is all you need to know. Alright, in all seriousness, yeah, they are called hanging dead, and I'm sure you noticed how they have green liquid instead of blood. These enemies are more proof of how the game was censored, since they have an alternate palette for the liquid that is clearly supposed to be blood. I really wish somebody gave this game a good hacking treatment, so the game has the intended amount of violence, among other things. Maybe it would be smart to do that with the PC port that was released for Windows in 2003.
And the second level has a trap door at the start. I'm assuming this guy here was hanging off of the door there. So after Rick died, he was not only thrown in the cabin, but in the basement cellar of the cabin. This detail is absent in the turbo port. I told you we were getting nerdy, folks.
I assume the reason the monsters threw people in there was to have them as test subjects for the experiments of Dr. West.
The only thing worth mentioning here is, again, no cleaver in the turbo port, only the 2x4. Not much to say about the water part or the poltergeist boss. They're pretty much the same, so let's move on to the next level.
I do think that it is worth pointing out that the poltergeist boss has more to it music-wise. There is even an unused phase for the song.
Level 3 is the outside path to the house. Not too much to talk about here either. The arcade is a little messier, there's a couple of rotting corpses here and there, but it's a pretty tame environment compared to the first two levels.
I'm guessing that maybe the stage was worked on right when Namco told the devs to tone it down with the graphic violence in the game.
There's renegade birds in the arcade version. There's your Hitchcock reference.
I'm amazed that they did not use bats to replace the bird enemies in stage 3. That's what I'm talking about when I say oversight.
And there's trees and bushes that hide a couple of rocks from view. One big change here is the TurboGrafx port uses the song from the first level again. We'll come back to that in a bit. The shotgun trick is still a must here because one of the toughest bosses in the game is guarding the entrance to the house, Biggie Man.
He's actually called Piggy Man, although I do like the mistranslated Biggie Man name.
I don't think this guy right here is fucking awesome. I don't think you and I can be friends.
I don't wanna be your friend anyway. He's fine if you want another Jason Voorhees-based character in this game.
Splatterhouse fans demanded that Biggie Man be brought back for the remake. In fact, it was one of the first things I remember hearing confirmed.
And then said fans didn't bother to buy the game, I guess.
Here's a small detail. When you defeat Biggie Man in the TurboGrafx port, he's reduced to nothing. But in the arcade version, he just simply falls over.
I know, he is definitely more limited in animations in the home port.
But it would unfortunately be 20 years before we got a chance to settle the score with our terrifying friend. Level 4, the house. Much like with level 3, there's only subtle differences to the graphics. The house is a bit decrepit and there's a couple of bodies thrown about. It's nothing we haven't seen before.
They're basically recycled graphics.
In the TurboGrafx port, the house is pristine by comparison. One thing I'll say is they really nailed the song down in the port. I almost prefer the TurboGrafx version of the arcade. Not too much to say about the Hall of Mirrors. When you defeat your doppelgangers in the arcade version, they're reduced to dust, whereas in the turbo port they just blink and disappear. Yeah, not too much to talk about here.
Well, you are wrong, because there is a minor detail that you can notice when you see your reflection doing a kick. when you do it in the PC Engine version, it clearly doesn't make sense, since the limitations didn't allow for the inclusion of the sprite animation of the backside of Rick doing the kick.
The boss. This is the only place in the TurboGrafx port where we see the cleaver. In the arcade version, it was the only time we saw an axe. In fact, this is the only time we see an axe in the entire series. I'm pretty sure, at least. Another thing I've noticed is the boss is a lot tougher in the Turbo port. The masks off-screen fly in at a really awkward time and angle. It gives it a nice challenge instead of being a total pushover like he is in the arcade version.
I think this boss is not harder in either of the versions, it just works differently. For example, if you take too long to beat this boss in the arcade game, then a couple spirits, I think they are that, they will come and make things even harder if not impossible. Whereas in the home version, you can take as long as you want.
And I'm sure you noticed this is the boss who was an inverted cross in all versions except the American TurboGrafx port.
Don't forget the mobile Java port, cause they replaced the cross on that version too.
Furthermore, the crosses on the arches and the altar have also been removed. But for whatever reason, the candles and the church hymn were not.
I think the reason they didn't remove the candles was because that's a sprite object, so I guess they didn't remove them, because it would have been way too much work to properly remove them. Or maybe as just again, another oversight.
So when you kill the evil mask in the Turbo port, you're treated to a completely out-of-place song and floating candles. Also, Jennifer's scream is missing in the home ports, so this sudden swell of music is meaningless and kind of funny.
Seeming oversight again, although I guess you can call it a sign that this version was somewhat rushed. In any case, they could have used the death scream from the girl-looking ghosts of Stage 5 as a good compromise. Even when that scream is made with the PSG sound channel, it does sound pretty convincing, and as you saw earlier, it worked very well when I added the sound effect onto my demonstration footage.
Level 5, Jennifer. Before we start the actual level, I want to point out this little piece of music. Remember how Level 3 reused Level 1's theme instead of using the track from the arcade? Well, this little piece is a reworking from that song, used to much greater effect between levels. Here, listen. Do you hear it? Now let's compare.
I think both of them are good.
I personally think the piece in the TurboGrafx port is much more effective, especially if you know what's coming. This level may be the longest in the game. It goes like this. You first start off in a room with chairs, then a room with jumping hands and tilted floors, then you get to choose your own path for the next 3 screens. I want to talk about the room with the necromancer. In the arcade version, I swear he's saying, "I'm grooving."
Yeah, that's definitely not what he says, but if I have to guess, he probably says, "I rule," which would make sense in the context that he is controlling the enemies of the room. He is ruling them in that sense.
Yeah, and why wouldn't he be? Listen to that song. Shit, I'd be grooving too if my girl wasn't in trouble. And speaking of which, let's jump ahead to the boss fight because there's a lot to talk about there. Now, I'm sure I don't have to explain this part to you because I already spoiled the shit out of this scene a few years back. Sorry about that. Anyway, there's a little controversy over what exactly Jennifer is saying here. My darling or I'm dying? I think she's saying my darling because I can hear an L.
I guess it's a miracle that you can hear an L, since there is no L in the Japanese language. The reason I'm saying that was because as far as I know, these voice clips were made by one of the developers, and he was definitely not a woman. And I'm sure he was speaking quote-unquote English, so that, in addition to the kinda low quality of the audio, makes it fairly tough to understand what they are saying. By the way, I also hear, my darling, especially if I take a guess on how that would be said in English.
Also, I'm dying doesn't make much sense logically because up to this point, she's just woken up and seen her man. She doesn't know what's about to happen. She's happy and relieved and shouts, "Oh, my darling!" Then this happens. Oh man, my life was changed forever when I saw that when I was 12 years old. But let's watch the arcade version. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Cruel, disturbing, vile, and great fucking storytelling.
I believe I didn't think much of this when I played this as a kid. Cause maybe that was because I knew that in this game, everything was most likely going to be sad, tragic, and of course, violent, and insensitively disturbing.
Now here's where my preferences split. Human Jennifer's cries of pain and her mutant form's maniacal laugh in the arcade version still give me shivers, especially when she screams and laughs at the same time at the beginning. Ugh. And this song's driving, pounding bass ratchets up the tension. It's an amazing fight that the turbo port just doesn't do justice, except for one huge difference. The fight with Jennifer has 3 parts, and between each one she reverts back to her human self, just long enough to speak for a moment. And in the turbo port, Jennifer very clearly pleads, that's right, help me. She doesn't cry out in pain or laugh maniacally, but that tiny plea is so effective. In the arcade version, I have absolutely no idea what she's saying. What? Huh? I think she's saying, "Oh, help me," but it sounds more like, "Whoa, whoa, whoa."
I guess that's what you can call moon language.
I'm really torn over which version I prefer, but you know when it comes down to it, this moment is pretty much the reason why I love Splatterhouse. So why be picky?
What about playing the games though? I guess he answered that in his previous videos. And in case you're wondering, yes, I did watch those videos, but I don't remember much about them. Also, what do you mean by why being picky? You have to do that if you want to get nerdy and wily with this.
Now here's an important thing to note. When you kill Jennifer, she dies in different ways in each version. In the turbo port, she crumbles to dust in your arms. In the arcade version, she chillingly thanks you, then says goodbye, and her body, or perhaps her soul, whisks away.
I sometimes think of this scene when I'm holding or looking at a dead A, and yes, I said dead A, you're gonna have to guess what the A stands for, cause I don't want YouTube giving me shit somehow for that. All I'm gonna say is, I didn't harm anything or anyone. In fact, I did the complete opposite.
This is important because in Splatterhouse 2, we learn that Jennifer is actually still alive.
I wouldn't say she is alive per se.
In fact, you travel to the depths of some horrible dimension to save her. Now that's romantic.
I just have to be a nerdy white boy here by telling you that is called the Land of the Dead.
This is either because it's just her body the monster's deflowered, not her soul, which is now trapped in another dimension, or that wasn't Jennifer at all, and her body and soul are in another dimension. Either way, she's gone now, and Rick has unfinished business, so he jumps down a hole, which is way more gross looking in the arcade version. Level 6, the Heart. Not much to say about this level, it's still a pain in the ass. It's a good thing to point out that the controls in the TurboGrafx port are a lot more precise. Rick just seems to move a little more sluggish in the arcade.
The controls are a mixed bag on both versions if you ask me. There is certain stuff that might be better in the arcade version, while others are better in the home version. Here's an example. When you turn around in the arcade version, you move a few pixels forward to the direction you're turning to. This can make dodging easier when you can get used to it, in addition to giving you more range to attack, but it can also make tight situations more difficult. The home version doesn't have the same way of turning, so it's not as easy to quickly dodge certain stuff as a result, but at the same time, it does avoid the problem of getting hit if you turn around too late or in a tight or tense situation. Another small example is that in the home version, I swear that the attack button doesn't work sometimes when using a weapon while turning around to attack. That is what I mean when I say that the controls in both versions are a mixed bag. They are still functional enough though.
And having that turbo switch is really helpful. Oh, but watch out, in the arcade version, the heart spews harmful waste at you when it dies.
No thanks. I'll get close to it and duck while you use your cheap turbo feature.
In the turbo port, it just explodes and disappears. Kinda like in Contra. The final level, level 7. This level is short, but there's only a few minor differences here, like the fire guys flail in the arcade, and you arrive at a cross instead of a tombstone. There's that missing religious imagery again.
The tombstone does seem to have a small cross though.
Here the boss moans every so often in the arcade version, but remains silent on the TurboGrafx. Both versions pull out all the stops to make whatever the hell this thing is beautifully detailed in all its disgusting glory. Now, it's never really explained what or who exactly this is you're fighting, and why the mask summoned him.
I always assumed that maybe it was a mutated Dr. West. And maybe when he died, he attached his soul to the mask, or perhaps it was an experiment that went wrong, and it needed the mask to work properly.
Either way, there's not much more to talk about here, so let's move on to the ending. Once the final boss has been defeated, a giant ghost-like face rises from the ground and explodes with white energy. In the arcade, we see the image of Rick walking away from the burning house when the mask shatters off his face.
If you look closely, Rick seems to have a different outfit. Apparently that is because he was meant to be a crazy lunatic that escaped from an asylum, and he was chasing Jennifer in the woods when both of them found the Splatterhouse, and you would then play as him. I'm sure that was rejected when Namco requested to tone things down.
After sitting through one of the most beautiful and depressing songs ever written, we pan down to see the mask reform and laugh distressingly. In the turbo port, we just see a close-up of the mask shattering into white pieces. Interesting.
They clearly didn't edit that when they censored the American release.
Again, we're treated to an incredibly moving song, concluding with the word end. I remember being so pissed off at how ambiguous this ending was when I first played it. I spent the rest of my day beating the game on hard mode just to see if there would be a different ending. And man, was I pissed when I found out that there wasn't one.
Well, that's not too different from the ending from the game Mega Man ZX Advent, and how the game's ending implies that there is more when there technically isn't. I mentioned that because I also played that game on hard mode to see if I would get some sort of extra mode, but no, that was it. The ending was meant to be stuff that we would see in a future sequel that sadly never happened.
Not only that, I was confused as all hell when I got my hands on the second game. The mask was back, the house was back, Jennifer was back. It would have made a little more sense if I had known about the arcade version, but there was no internet back then, so how was I supposed to know?
Well, that technically is not true. There was internet back then. It's just it was more limited, and obviously, there wasn't as much content online.
Okay, well that's about all I have to say about Splatterhouse. Well, I mean, I could go on. I fucking love these games.
I remember when I couldn't bring myself to like these games, because I was always told that they were basically Satanism, and I would feel guilty for liking any of this. Keep in mind that I was still a kid that could be easily fooled, but now that I don't believe in any of that religious or satanic stuff, I can safely say that I do like these games, both on gameplay and story.
But I think I've said enough for now. There's actually a ton of stuff I didn't go over, but that's why they invented encyclopedias and fan sites. If you want to know more about Splatterhouse, the West Mansion has been the place since before I even started making videos.
I think that website is no longer editable, so if you go there, then it is probably going to be an archive version of everything. Oh well, at least it didn't go away like the website Sonic Cult. And there you go, that stopped Skeletons from Fighting's decade-old video. For the time, it is a decent enough video that I did overall enjoy. I do see some stuff that he could have done better though, but hey, that tends to happen when producing videos. I think I don't have anything else to say, so see you later.